story of a business, a very good business. From their hotel room, these two men persuade trusting people to give them their life savings. It's simple. All they need is a few names and a phone.
Hello?
Is this Mildred Cushman?
Yes, it is.
Good morning, Mrs. Cushman. My name is Robert Marks. I'm a federal bank examiner. We're investigating some questionable activities by an employee at the North Harbor Federal Savings.
North Harbor, that's where I bank.
Yes, ma'am. We got your name from the bank. But before we talk any further, I will have to check a few more facts. You are the Mildred Cushman who resides at 1428 Harcourt Terrace Drive?
Yes, that's right.
And your account number is 657-48976?
Yes, I think so.
Well, of course, we must be sure. Perhaps you can tell us your bank balance, just to the nearest thousand figure?
The nearest thousand? Let's see. I made a withdrawal last month. About $8,000, I think.
Yes, that's right, Mrs. Cushman. Just about $8,000. Now, Mrs. Cushman, we would like to ask your help. One of the tellers at your bank is suspected of manipulating funds. I'm sure you can understand just how ticklish this kind of situation is. After all, we don't wish to give the bank or the teller a bad name. Our investigation may reveal nothing irregular. So I must ask you not to talk about this to anyone.
Of course, I'll be glad to help.
Good. We'd like you to go to the bank today. Go to window number 3, withdraw $7,000 in cash, and make sure that the teller correctly indicates the amount in your passbook. After you do that, return home. We'll meet you there and mark the money for redeposit. Then we'll be able to see if the teller misappropriates any funds.
Do you mean stealing?
Yes, ma'am, I do. And please remember, Mrs. Cushman, that the success of our investigation depends on your not talking to anyone about this. And, Mrs. Cushman, I would like to thank you in advance for your cooperation. If more people were like yourself, our work would be much easier.
I can be ready in an hour.
We'll send a taxi to take you there and back.
Oh, thank you very much. Goodbye now. Well, Harvey, this is going to be an interesting day.
Will Mildred Cushman lose her life savings to unscrupulous con men? Stay tuned for the exciting conclusion. And from now on, watch out for phone calls from so-called bank examiners. What you've just seen is a simulation of an actual con scheme found in police records. Unfortunately, real con schemes claim many victims. But every day of our lives, the rest of us are subjected one way or another to the gentle or not so gentle art of persuasion. Persuasion is communication. It's one person talking to another, a simple human act. But it's a special way of talking, one that tries to change your mind and your behavior. Many people try to change your mind every day, like your friends, your parents, the teachers in your schools. And probably you try to change their minds. Day by day, we rely on persuasive communication to live with one another. From dawn till dusk, everyone is subjected to so much persuasion that many of us just take persuasion for granted. But the persuaders never take us for granted. They spend billions of dollars every year, far more than America spends on education, pollution control, mental health, helping the poor, or advancing science. They spend these billions to persuade us to elect them, listen to them, fight for them, or just buy their products. The techniques they use are based on psychological research. Psychologists who study the persuasion process have found out the most important person in that process is you. Because for all its technological sophistication, persuasion still boils down to one person communicating with another. And to communicate with you successfully, the persuaders have to know just who you are. Well, just who are you anyway? The self-made businessman? Or the frustrated factory worker? The chic suburbanites? Or the militant mother? You might be none of these people, but chances are that you do belong to one of the 10 types of American adults described by psychologists. Based on several research projects, psychologists have attempted to classify people into types. But what exactly is a type? Well, a type is two or more people who think about things in a similar way. It's a group of people who share similar attitudes. When researchers try to find out who you are, it's your attitudes that interest them most. An attitude is a consistent way of thinking about something and responding to it. The researchers want to know what Americans think about politics, religion, sex, peanut butter, and everything else. Why? Because your attitudes are the targets of persuasion. Persuasion has to encourage you to think, or do, or buy things you otherwise would not. Persuasion tries to change your attitude. And psychologists have discovered 4 secrets to the success of persuasion. First secret: persuaders must have credibility. People must believe what the persuaders say. Otherwise, no one will listen. These are examples of what psychologists call high credibility communicators, the leaders of society. Their status gives them credibility. When they speak, people tend to believe them, because we all tend to respect authority.
Man, oh man. I wish I was your age and driving these wheels. Boy.
This is a low credibility communicator. Why? Because few people trust a used car salesman. We expect that he'll say anything to sell us a car. We expect him to lie. But the fact is that the used car salesmen of this world make a lot of sales, despite what their customers think of them. They must be doing something right. Actually, many things contribute to credibility. First and foremost, the communicators must appear to be experts. We just won't believe people who don't convince us that they know what they're talking about. But who are the experts? The man in this scene isn't a doctor or a pharmacist. He's an actor in a television commercial. But he certainly looks and sounds like a doctor, doesn't he?
Here's Phillips Milk of Magnesia. Gentle, thorough laxity. And Milk of Magnesia is the answer to the question.
Which laxative do doctors recommend?
You don't need to be a real authority figure to be credible. You just have to look like you are, sound like you are, and act like you are. You need charisma. You need the right style.
Police,
and then, no matter who you really are, people will tend to believe what you say in spite of themselves. Psychologically speaking, your foot is in the door.
You guys did a real good job of fixing this door.
Persuasion's second secret is convincing the audience that the audience's best interests, not the communicators, will be served by giving in to persuasion. That means the communicators must know what those interests are. Let's go back to our car salesman. What's his pitch?
It's got an awful lot of miles on it. Ah, come on. You know what people are going to think, don't you? There's a guy who knows class. Yeah, that's no bull, believe me. You know something? You really do look like a guy who knows class. Sharp.
Notice that he didn't explain why the car has so many miles on it. Instead, he flattered his customer. He sells cars by appealing to basic human vanity. Vanity is probably a surefire appeal to every audience. But universal appeals aren't enough. All the studies which classify people into types have shown that each type is a separate audience. Each audience has its own level of education, its own status in society, and its own distinct attitudes. The wrong audience can invalidate credibility. Whoever uses this blonde to sell a product had better hope no feminists are watching. And this beautiful model can sell millions of dollars worth of perfume in a year. But can this woman scientist be more persuasive than a male counterpart? Research says no, because given the choice, people will still consistently believe a male authority over an equally qualified female. So, the third secret, the message has to fit the audience. For example, would the following commercial sell bread to a college professor?
Well, Interstate 80, I was cooking alive, thermometer red, about 105. I had a 10-ton old home bread truck pumping all day, pumping out steam. Had 1,000 cubes and they was running cool. Was till I run out of bread truck fuel at the old home filler up and keep on the trucking cafe. Give me 10 gallons. Well, she filled my tank. I said, thank you, honey. Her name was Mavis. I gave her the money. Says, how's about an old home burger and an ice cream cone? Cool myself off with a patty on the grill, and back she came. Says, tell me, truck man, what's your name? I said, C.W.
I doubt if any professors are still listening. But the advertisers don't care. They've targeted their message at the much larger audience of potential customers who identify with truck drivers.
Well, I finished up the burger, said bye now, hon, then I left her a truckload of old home buns for the old home filler up and keep on the trucking cafe. Old home is good buns.
On the other hand, nobody would understand what you're about to hear. It's a simulation, because you'd never actually hear anything like it on television.
This program is for the select intelligentsia who deem the eschewal of egregious conceptions maximally enervating. It is for sesquipedalians, untimorous regarding onomatopoetic construction.
Experts have to decide which communications medium works best. Television can't communicate complex ideas as well as the written word. But most persuaders deliver their messages with simple words that everyone can understand.
How's your love life?
Oh, wow. The reporters and the fans, excited.
How's your love life?
What's the love life?
How's your love life?
If communicators achieve credibility, if they understand their audience, and if they tailor their message to their audience's attitudes, communicators still might fail to persuade anyone to do or buy or think anything if they don't know the fourth secret of persuasion. They have to find out if their audience really was persuaded by their message. They need to find out if they succeeded or failed, and if they did fail, how they should change the message to succeed. They need feedback. Psychologists have found that in persuasive communication, a little feedback may make all the difference.
Where do I stand on the issue of war? You know exactly where I stand. I say, whoop 'em good. Give 'em the gun. Well, guns and butter. De-escalation. Beat your swords into plowshares. Peace order. A new age for mankind. Peace,
brother. Those who know all four secrets can use them for good or evil. Mrs. Cushman's bank examiners created an illusion of credibility. They seemed to have confidential information about her. Their voices were firm and authoritative. Their message was designed to con their easiest victims, elderly widows who are eager to help the authorities. Past successes had given them enough feedback to know it would work. And once again, it did. Mrs. Cushman went to the bank and brought the $7,000 home.
Just a minute, please.
Mrs. Cushman?
Yes?
I'm Robert Marks with the Federal Banking System, and this is Inspector Fuller.
Won't you come in?
Oh, what a lovely place you have here, Mrs. Cushman.
Thank you. Won't you sit down? I have the money.
Good. Bill, why don't you mark it? Mrs. Cushman, on behalf both of ourselves and the federal government, I'd like to thank you once again for your assistance in this investigation. Believe me, your cooperation is sincerely appreciated.
Well, I'm only too glad to be of help. Would you like a cup of tea?
Oh, no, thanks very much, ma'am. We've got to be moving along.
Here it is. It's all marked.
Fine. Now, Mrs. Cushman, when you take this back to the bank, be sure that the same teller accepts the deposit.
Bob, I think it's a little too late to go back now.
You're right. I'll tell you what. Why don't we keep this in the vault overnight? I'm afraid it's a little dangerous to keep such a large sum of money in your house.
Oh, I'd be very happy if you did. I'd worry about having so much money around.
Bill, why don't you give Mrs. Cushman a receipt?
Here you are.
And thank you so much again.
Goodbye.
Sheriff's Department, you're under arrest.
Hey, what's going on here?
Step inside, Bank Examiner. There won't be any trouble.
These two con men had operated just once too often in Mrs. Cushman's area. Banks had already been warned when she asked to withdraw her money. The bank's security officer asked her to follow the con men's instructions so they could catch the men with the money in their possession. It worked.
Have a nice day.
Mrs. Cushman was lucky. This man, Dr. Sam Shepard of Cleveland, Ohio, was not so lucky. The misuse of Persuasion's secrets destroyed his legal rights. On July 4th, 1954, Sam Shepard's wife, Marilyn, was murdered in her bed. Shepard told police that intruders had killed his wife while he slept on a couch downstairs. When he awoke and discovered them, they knocked him out and fled. But despite his story, Sam Shepard was arrested for murder. He was soon released. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges against him. Dr. Shepard was happy, but the people of Cleveland weren't. They were convinced that Shepard was the murderer. And so was the Cleveland press.
I believe the page one editorials came about after a good number of people in the community, a good number of people outside of this community even, some law enforcement people in this community got the idea, the thought, right or wrong, that an attempt was being made by certain individuals to, in the vernacular, cover up what had happened in the Shepard home on the morning of July 4th, 1954.
The editor has just admitted that his newspaper's coverage of the Shepard case was based on feedback from its readers. In other words, the Cleveland press gave its audience the message it knew they wanted to hear, and ultimately persuaded a jury to convict Sam Shepard of murder. A barrage of inflammatory headlines resulted in Shepard's rearrest and indictment. His trial was conducted by a judge who was running for re-election. So was the prosecuting attorney. Both wanted to look good in the press. So they gave news media a free hand. Flashbulbs popped and cameras rolled in court. The jurors were not kept in seclusion, but allowed to talk with friends and read the newspapers. What they read was as prejudiced as it was unproved. The Cleveland Press headlined a coroner's remark that the murder weapon might have been a surgical instrument. The coroner's theory was never proved, but that didn't matter. The paper ran articles claiming that if the dead Marilyn could speak, she would name her husband as the murderer. It published gossip and rumors. Day after day, it pounded home a single theme. Sam Shepard killed his wife. Shepard's lawyer tried unsuccessfully to move the trial out of Cleveland. Instead, the sensational case attracted nationwide attention. The most popular journalist in America flocked to what had become, in one lawyer's words, a circus. And they too stated to their millions of readers and listeners their presumption of Sam Shepard's guilt. By trial's end, the verdict seemed a mere formality.
We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant, Sam H. Shepard, not guilty of murder in the first degree, but guilty of murder in the second degree. James C. Bird, foreman.
Sam Shepard spent 6 years of a life sentence in prison before he was granted a new trial. He was finally acquitted of all charges after another 6 years of legal battles. His story is a tragic one, but it shows us how powerful persuasion can be if its 4 elements work together. The Cleveland Press and the journalist who covered the trial were highly credible communicators. Their audience trusted them to report objective fact. When they reported a wholly one-sided version of the Shepard case, the audience accepted it as truth, partly because of communicator credibility, but also because the message was the one the audience wanted to hear. They rewarded the distortions with positive feedback. In the same way, propaganda can be used to persuade an entire nation. The 20th century has seen the awesome successes of master propagandists like Adolf Hitler in Germany and Mao Zedong in China. Both created societies where citizens' attitudes were controlled by propaganda. Democratic Americans may not think they have much in common with Nazis or Chinese, but during the Shepard trial, their free press engaged in pure propaganda. Everyone's attitudes are vulnerable to persuasion. The fact is that attitudes are really very complex. Psychologists believe that what we think may not be what we do. We take it for granted that our attitudes are logical opinions about life based on our own experience. But studies have shown that more often than not, our opinions are very different from our actual behavior. Usually, we do what our peer group, our parents, or other authorities want us to, whether or not it agrees with our own attitudes. We're especially prone to peer pressure at certain periods of life, like the teenage years. But everyone is vulnerable at any age. Some psychologists even believe that our attitudes are merely rationalizations of things we've already done. From their research and from history, they conclude that people who understand the collective attitudes of a large mass of people can persuade them to do incredible things, things that most of them as individuals might never do. By now, you're probably worried that you're inevitably a helpless victim of persuasion. Well, don't worry. Persuasion doesn't always work, even when you think it has. When psychologists began studying persuasion, there were certain sacred truths about what guaranteed success. One of the most sacred was the effectiveness of fear. It was generally believed that the best way to make people agree with you was to make them afraid not to. Listen to this interview with a senator who's lobbying hard for a new missile system. The senator is really an actor. The missile system, fictitious. But you've heard his argument 100 times.
But more importantly, our enemies, any enemies, they too are capable of developing new weapon systems. They will develop them and they will use them. And we as a nation will be standing naked before the world. What I'm talking about here, our children, the safety and security of our children.
The senator wants to persuade you by arousing your fear. So do many campaigns which ask people to quit smoking, drive safely, or stay out of jail. They show horrible consequences in gruesome detail because, like the senator, they're convinced that fear is the most potent persuasive tool. And they're right, on a short-term basis. But psychologists have shown that fear seldom produces a long-term behavior change. Comparative studies prove that positive, helpful messages which gave people specific directions for altering their behavior changed attitudes much more successfully than fear. In fact, the most effective technique turned out to be the personal approach, a handshake, eye-to-eye contact, an appeal from a flesh-and-blood human being, and a chance for the audience to participate in campaigns designed to change their minds. Apparently, persuasion works best when it remains a gentle art. But it seems that, whatever the approach, only time will tell. Psychologists have discovered that a curious sleeper effect sometimes occurs among people subjected to persuasive communication. Some of them will first reject the message, only to agree with it when asked 6 months later. Others do just the opposite. The only explanation psychologists can give is that their subjects were influenced by the way the message was originally presented. The actual message didn't come across until after they'd forgotten where it came from.
Anyone who tries to persuade us, politicians, advertisers, even our friends and family, they may know us only through our stated attitudes. But if what we say we'll do isn't what we really do, how can anyone influence our behavior? Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. The everyday art of persuasion hasn't yielded all its secrets.